Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Just for Laughs. I'm your host, DC. I'm so glad you guys have come to join me for a special October podcast that I'll be doing on serial killers. True crime is something that has always fascinated me, and I've many times wanted to do podcast on true crime and serial killers. Um, Mostly just because it fascinates me the way these people do things and the way they think and why they think this way, because a lot of times they feel like their actions are justified or their actions are not really forced upon them as much as guided by certain circumstances in their life. It's something that has always just astounded me. I want to get into the minds of these crazy people and understand why they do what they do. So I have a book here called Cold Cases: Astonishing Investigations from the Green River Killer to John Bennett Ram. And it is by Charlotte Gregg, an author I've never heard of, but from the back here it says that Charlotte Gregg was a British novelist, playwright, music journalist, singer, and songwriter who lived in Cardiff, Wales. She graduated with an MA in intellectual history from Sussex University and began her career. I'm sorry, my mouth is dry. She began her career freelancing as a writer and editor for a variety of magazines and newspapers, including NME and The Guardian, which I don't know, but that's probably because they're real newspapers. She began writing books in 1989, and her titles include Horrible Histories, 20th Century Crime Fiction, and Evil Serial Killers. She also wrote a number of musical theater pieces, radio plays, and folk music albums, and was known as a presenter of music features and reviews on BBC Radio. So, I've never heard of her before, but I might do a podcast on her writings and her life, as that is something I think would be interesting for everybody. Something that I'm interested in as well. So there's a total of, I think probably, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. 32 serial killers. So if I were to do one a day, today is the 14th, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to do one a day. I recently got promoted at my place of business, and my schedule is a lot more full than it used to be, but I'm going to try my best, and I'm so sorry for the lateness of my podcast, as I really do want to expand this, and I enjoy giving you guys little interesting things to listen to. And I enjoy doing these podcasts because it allows me to kind of study and expand on things that I've been thinking about and wanting to share with you guys about. So today's the 14th, so if we counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So if I do one a day, we'll end sometime in the middle of November. I should have started on the beginning of October because I would have been able to do one a day and it would have filled the entire month up, but I did not. And I might do two a day so that I don't spill over into November, because there's some things coming up in November for podcast wise that I want to do, but we'll just have to see. We may not get through the whole book, and this may be a once a year sort of thing where I talk about some serial killers. Excuse me. But tonight, and these stories aren't very long, so I hope these podcasts don't bore you. I always have loved true crime myself, but I know that it's not everyone's cup of tea, if you will, but I hope that whoever does listen to this enjoys it. And I don't know, let me see. Okay, I think this first one is called, this first one's about Danny Keith Hooks, the crack house murderers. And I will begin reading. I'm just going to read, and I might stop and comment. So, It says, in cold blood. Murder is always shocking, but there are certain murders that seem, for whatever reason, to be more lurid than most. These cold cases where it is the crime, not the killer, that remains in the public. These are the cold cases where it is the crime and not the killer that remains in the public imagination. The Crack House Murders is a sordid tale in which addict Danny Keith Hooks killed 5 women in a crack house where the women came to sell sex for drugs, apparently after attempting to involve them in an orgy. Oh, my Lanta. His crimes went undetected for 5 years, but eventually he was picked up for rape, and his DNA profile was found to match that of samples recovered from the scene of the crime. In the case of the lady in the lake, victim Carol Parks' relatives had to wait 21 years before finding out what happened to her. Her body was found by scuba divers in Constant Water, which I'm assuming is a lake. Oh yeah, it says Constant Water, a beauty spot in the north of England, which eventually led to the conviction of her ex-husband, Gordon, for her murder. The Bone Breaker is a tale of deranged teenager Joel Clark, who enjoyed hearing his victims' bones break before killing them. It was only when one of his victims escaped that he was caught and put behind bars. In the slaughter of the innocents, we look at the Sosaler Peterson case, in which 3 boys were brutally murdered after an innocent trip to the cinema in Chicago. Here, the murderer Kenneth Hansen was brought to the book after several of his ex-lovers and friends testified against him. Finally, Carol Smith was kept captive as a slave for 7.5 years by a couple named Janice and Cameron Hooker. She was only rescued when Janice Hooker became jealous of her and tipped off the police. So that was just kind of an summary of what the book's going to be about. Some of the murders, and there are 32 serial killers we'll talk about. And so I think that this book is going to be very interesting and exciting. This first serial killer, Danny Keith Hooks, and the Crack House Murders, is only 5 pages long. So I'll just go ahead and read the whole thing and then kind of give what I think or give my thoughts about the story. So let's begin. Danny Keith Hooks, the Crack House Murders. One of the most shocking multiple murders to occur in the 1990s, was that of 5 black women who were stabbed to death in a crack house in the northeast area of Oklahoma City. The murders that occurred in 1992, I'm sorry, I think I'm trying to read too fast. The murders occurred in 1992, but it was not until 5 years later that the authorities caught up with the perpetrator, who had managed to steer clear of the law, evading all responsibility for such a terrible crime up until that time. On May 16th, 1992, the police were called to a crack house to find a horrifying scene. It was one of carnage. 5 women lay dead, butchered by an unknown assailant. They were all found naked, lying in pools of blood, and 4 of the victims were also found to have been sexually assaulted. The victims were 47-year-old Phyllis Adams, 35-year-old Sandra Thompson, 37-year-old Carolyn Watson, 30-year-old LaShawn Evans, and 34-year-old Frenzel Roberts. Butchered in a crack house. Samples of blood were taken from some of the women's clothing, including 2 shirts and a jacket, as well as a bloody handprint that was found on a curtain. However, the murder investigation launched at the time yielded no results, and no suspect was named. And they have a picture here of a DNA analysis, or whatever you would call someone who analyzes DNA, holding up a piece of the clothing. And it says down below that storing DNA profiles, people who have committed crimes in earlier years now stand a very good chance of being linked to their past if they offend again, thanks to DNA evidence. Which I don't know much about DNA evidence, but I do know that it's honestly not that old of a thing. It's fairly new within the past 50 years or so, I think. And I mean, I think they've always had it to a certain aspect, but it has certainly evolved into something that allows us to find um, the suspect much quicker now because of how advanced things are getting, which I think is a really good thing, especially when it comes to um, rapes and such. I do know that when it comes to anything sexual, if um, a woman was raped, it's essential that they get to the hospital quickly because they can do a DNA rape uh, kit test, and it's either the hospital or the police station. I'm not for sure. Don't quote me on either one of those because I'm not for certain on that. I think probably either one could do it. I would probably call the police and then the hospital. Um, but I know that you're not supposed to take a shower, I think, and you should do it as quickly as you can because the DNA is actually going to go away in cases of rape. Um, and we'll all just use our brains to understand why that happened. Let's continue. The multiple murders shocked the local community, and the police were criticized for failing to find the killer. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, accused the law enforcement agencies of racism, saying they were not making enough effort to find the culprit because the victims were black and were frequenting a crack house. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but unfortunately, I think this is something that all law enforcement has dealt with at one point or another, especially today. And I don't think it matters what color you are. There's always people out there who assume that if something's not done, it's because of racism or some other prejudice like that. And I know that there are some bad eggs in the law enforcement around the nation, but I think for the most part we have very brave men and women who risk their lives to keep our streets and our towns and our cities safe. And I tip my hats to them and salute them because it is a job that I'm not able to or want to do. And I'm very grateful for those who keep our streets clean of crime. So if you ever see a police officer, I would shake their hand and thank them for their service because I don't think that happens enough. I know so many people would just say, well, let's just go back to the way it was, no police or anything. And that would just be complete chaos because without some form of enforcement to help keep our cities safe, we would have nothing. And I know that a lot of people like to blame the police for this and that, but without them, I truly think that our cities and towns would be lost to crime. So let's keep in mind the law enforcement that we deal with on a daily basis and understand that it's no different really from the jobs that you and I do. We are just trying to do our jobs, as are they. They're just trying to do their jobs, and I know that they appreciate not just cooperation, but the respect that they truly do deserve. So where was I? Frequenting crack house. The house was known as a place where penniless drug addicts, mostly women, came to sell sex in return for drugs. Many commentators from the black community felt like because of the house's bad reputation, very little was being done to bring the killer of these women to justice. It was not until 5 years later that the police ran the DNA profile of Danny Keith Hooks into their computer database. Hooks had been picked up on a charge of rape. To their surprise, it matched the samples taken from the scene of the crime at the crack house. The evidence was compelling, and Hooks was soon brought to trial and charged with 5 murders. At the trial, Hooks claimed that the body... I'm sorry. At the trial, Hooks claimed that the bloody handprint on the curtain was the result of a cut on his hand, and that he had sustained from riding his bicycle. He admitted that he had smoked crack at the house earlier that day with the 5 women, and that he had sex with 2 of them. However, he said that he had then decided to leave the house, and it was only when he returned later that he had found the dead bodies. The prosecution alleged that, to the contrary, Hooks had killed the women in a frenzy of violence. He was a crack addict who had become mentally unstable as a result of his addiction and had tried to force the women into a sex orgy with him. When they had refused and tried to leave, he had attacked them, killing all 5 women. The death penalty. The jury in the case deliberated for 14 hours, which is an astoundingly long time. Shorter than some cases, but that's a long time. And I think it was well needed for this criminal to get what he deserved. The jury in the case deliberated for 14 hours over a period of 2 days. What held their deliberation up was the fact that it was hard to understand how 5 women could have been killed apparently easily by one man. But in the end, they decided that was what had happened. They therefore returned a verdict of guilty. On hearing the verdict, Hooks showed no reaction. He was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Commenting on the death penalty for Hooks, the daughter of victim Phyllis Adams, Barbara Brooker, I believe her name is Barbara Brooker. That's confusing sentence. Said, "I don't think he deserves to live because those women did not have a choice." And they have a picture of a lethal injection bed with some straps and such on it. And it says, "Guilty. Danny Keith Hooks received 5 separate death sentences for the murder." And that is the story of the crack house murders and the killer, Danny Keith Hooks. That's an interesting case. Like I said, this it's kind of a small book. So if any of you would like me to go into deeper detail, just tell me in the comments, and I will take a week, study whichever killer you want me to study or whatever mysterious case, and I'll come back and we'll do a podcast on it. So that way you can learn more about that without having to study it yourself, because I'm more than willing to do that. And if you do put a request, I will give you a shout out for putting in a request, and because I enjoy giving people recognition for good podcasts. So what do I think about this case? I don't know. I mean, I think it's fairly apparent that this man was guilty. Like I said, this book is so short, it doesn't really give a lot of evidence of this or that, and I don't know what their verdict was really based on, except the fact that there really was no other explanation. Perhaps these 5 women killed themselves, so I find it very suspicious that he ended up making out of there. And in my mind, if they're all on crack, including Danny Keith himself, and he had a withdrawal or whatever, or came down, or whatever the technical jargon is for a drug addict that no longer has drugs, I wouldn't be surprised if he did kill them, because I suppose when you're on crack, you're not quite able to defend yourself, and 5 cracked out women is probably no match for a non-cracked out crazy man. And I know that our prayers and our thoughts do go up to these women, even though it wasn't in 1990, but their siblings and family members are probably well in their 60s to 90s now, and I know that they have to think about this every single day and be sad about it. And it is a shame that there's so much crime in our world. I do wish that the world was a much more peaceful place, but unfortunately it's not, and I don't think it ever will be in my lifetime. These are going to be rather sober podcasts, because death and serial killings is no laughing matter by any means, but I do think it's important for us to research them and understand them, so that way we can not just help those who are mentally unstable, but so that way we can be aware of the dangers of the world, because if you bury your head in the sand, it's impossible for you to be able to know how to protect yourself in situations, because it could happen to any of us. And I know it's rather scary to think about it, but unfortunately that is reality, and that is unfortunately just the world we live in. So anyway, everybody, thank you very much for listening to this podcast. This was the story of the crack house murders and the murder Danny Keith Hooks. And tomorrow, or whenever I make another podcast, I'm hoping tomorrow, I'm going to try to sit down and do it, is the story of Gordon Park, the lady in the lake. And it says here one of the longest murder inquiries ever to take place in the United Kingdom was finally resolved when Gordon Park was brought to trial and found guilty of murdering his wife. The crime had happened 21 years before and might have never been discovered had not amateur drivers in the beautiful Lake District of north of England came across a body one summer's day, the body of a woman in a blue baby doll nightdress. So that one sounds like it's going to be a riveting story, and that will be for another day. I do hope that everyone has a nice night. I hope you guys enjoy this podcast, however sober and serious it might be. I will be putting more of these up, and if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them in the comments down below. If you'd like to see me play some video games, kind of do something a little lighter, I do have a Mixer channel, which I will put the description or the link for that in the description down below, and I believe the channel is mixer.com/@cursingbubble17. That's mixer.com/@cursingbubble17. And I will just check and make sure that for sure before I go ahead and put that in. And if you guys want to get this book for yourself, it's called Cold Cases, The Astonishing Investigations from the Green River Killer to John Bennett Ram. And it's by Charlotte Greigs. I got it at Barnes & Noble for $7.98. It's a pretty, it's not a thick book. It just has big pages. And there's technically 207 pages. So it's a good read, I suppose, for someone who wants to do some light, serious reading. For those of you who read like me, I could have it done in a day, honestly. But we'll read through it together, you and me. So anyway, guys, thank you very much for listening to this podcast. If you have any other ideas for podcasts, please tell me, and I will take them into great consideration and give you a shout out if I end up doing a podcast on your topic. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Please come on back. Try to have some laughs. I know that a lot of my podcasts aren't very laughy, but I named the channel just for laughs, and I sometimes regret it because it seems like a lot of my podcasts have nothing to do with laughing. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening, and I will hear you, or rather, you will hear me in the next podcast. Have a great night, guys. Bye-bye.